Okay, I'm gonna start talking now, so I don't surprise either one of you guys. Hello, good afternoon. My name is Dakota Hufford, and I am the Outreach and Stewardship Coordinator and resident entomologist here at the Clackamas River Basin Council. Thank you so much for watching this video on some unconventional pollinators. When most people think of pollinators, they kind of immediately picture the poster children, bees and butterflies, and both are incredibly important, but pollination in ecosystems is shared by a huge diversity of insects. Flies, beetles, wasps, moths, and even some ants move pollen while feeding on plant parts. Today, I want to highlight some of the unconventional pollinators that live right here in Clackamas County, go over some quick ID tips and local species, and use pollinators as a starting point to talk about something bigger. Why conserving all invertebrates matters for healthy ecosystems, especially now as we face a major invertebrate extinction crisis. So just some quick insect ID tips, just quick and dirty. When trying to take pictures of bugs, more pictures is always better. When you really start to nerd out, you start becoming more familiar with taxonomy and insect orders. But when taking pictures, a steady hand is really important. And knowing those insect features does become really important and helpful as well. Microscopes and magnifying glasses are helpful, but not always necessary. Keys and dichotomous keys are tools that you can use where using insect features, you go through a series of questions answered by the features that are present, and kind of like a choose your own adventure game, you end up with a species name at the end. Ultimately, I end up putting a lot of things into an app, but I'm always cautious and do a lot of cross-referencing. So, quick and dirty, insects always have 6 legs and 3 body parts, a head, a thorax, and an abdomen, and they always have a pair of antennae, whereas spiders have 8 legs and 2 body parts. And here is a reference of both of those types of bodies. I use some apps to help me when I'm IDing. I can often definitely get to order, which, for example, an order is Coleoptera, for example, is the order of beetles. So it can be quite large. Um, and so I end up using an app a lot of the time. My 2 starting points for identifying insects inside of an app are Picture Insect and then Google Lens. After that, sometimes features on some of the smartphones, like iPhone, in their photos, has a feature that you can swipe up on the photo and it will give you a guess at identification. So I go kind of off of those 3. And then last, I will kind of rely on Merlin and Seek. They're not as filled out as some of the other apps. So like I said, I like to start with Picture Insect and then use Google Lens and then try and cross-reference a lot. So why are pollinators a good starting point for any conversation about insects? I think it's kind of obvious that conservation conversations, um, bugs need a spokesperson, and pollinators are really good at being that. People already understand their importance in our food systems, wildflowers, and in general, they're highly visible and charismatic as organisms. But when we focus only on pollinators, we do sometimes miss the bigger ecological picture or fail to highlight the importance of other insects. Pollinators exist within complex food webs of other invertebrates, predators, decomposers, herbivores, and scavengers. Healthy ecosystems need all of these roles filled. Additionally, all insects are food for everyone, which moves nutrients through different ecosystems and layers of the web. So while we'll talk about pollinators today, the bigger takeaway is that not all pollinators are bees and butterflies, and also supporting pollinators always means supporting the entire invertebrate community. It is easy to open up your heart to a beautifully colored butterfly or a fuzzy little bee, but what about the rat-tailed maggot? Syrphid flies are the second most important pollinator group after bees, and their larvae can survive in even the most dirty water. Where is their PR? And here is our rat-tailed maggot. In their larval stages, they are called a rat-tailed maggot for obvious reasons of the tail. That tail is called a siphon, and it allows them to get oxygen from the air while living in very oxygen poor water. And then they become a dronefly, which are some of the most prolific and efficient pollinators in any ecosystem. So they're super important and not really as cute as a butterfly. So what is an unconventional pollinator? So when an insect visits a flower, pollen can stick to its body in a variety of ways and then be carried to the next flower. That's pollination. Some insects, like bees, have evolved very specialized ways of doing this. They actively collect pollen using structures like pollen baskets on their legs called corbicula, and they're intentionally moving it in between plants. But bees aren't the only insects that are adapted to interact with flowers. Flies, beetles, moths, wasps, and ants all have traits and relationships with plants that allow them to pick up and move pollen just in different kinds of ways. For example, flies often have hairy bodies and large surface areas that pollen can stick to. Beetles tend to crawl directly through flowers and feed on pollen, which brings them into contact with the reproductive structures of the plant. And moths and butterflies use their long mouth parts to reach nectar, and in doing so, can brush against the pollen. So while they may not have specialized pollen carrying structures like bees, all of these other insects are still well adapted to interact with flowers and help in their reproduction. Different insects are also visiting flowers for different reasons. Some feed on nectar, some feed on pollen, some are hunting the other insects visiting the flower, some are using the flower for shelter or resting. And all these interactions can result in pollination. So rather than thinking of pollination as something only done by a few highly specialized insects, it's more accurate to think of it as a process supported by a wide range of species, each contributing in their own way. Flies, to me, are the most overlooked pollinator. This is in the order Diptera, and they are actually some of the most abundant pollinators in temperate ecosystems. This is in part due to them being a generalist group, whereas other insects and almost all primary pollinators rely on sometimes just one very specific species of native plant to complete their life cycle. Flies are pretty much down to eat anything. Flies pollinate in ways similar to bees. They visit flowers to drink the nectar for energy or get nutrients for sexual maturation. Many are hairy and trap pollen on their head and thorax. Hoverflies and blowflies are particularly important. Many hoverflies mimic bees or wasps, but if you look closely, you'll see that they only have one pair of wings instead of two. Even better, the terrestrial hoverfly larvae are often aphid predators, so these insects contribute to both pollination and pest control. And the picture here is a yellow-haired sunfly. Here we have on the left side, a dronefly with the female on top and the male on bottom, and then a black marginated flower fly, a female. And then on the left, we have a margined calligrapher fly, and then on the right, we have a blowfly. Blowflies are pretty important, actually, in a lot of different ways. They're in the family Calliphoridae. These are the metallic blue-green or bronze flies you might associate with carrion, dead things, or waste. But despite their love of poop and dead things, they're actually super important pollinators. Adult blowflies regularly visit flowers to feed on nectar and pollen, especially early in the season or in cooler weather when bees may be less active. Because they're strong flyers and highly mobile, they can move pollen between plants across relatively large distances. They're particularly important for certain types of plants, including early blooming species when it's still too cold out for the bees, open and accessible flowers. I often see them on daisies. Some plants that mimic the smell of decay to attract flies, such as the death lily. And again, in some ecosystems, flies, much of which are blowflies, can make up a very significant portion of the total pollination activity. And this is especially true for places that are cooler and wetter, like the Pacific Northwest. Another important point is that blowflies are active under conditions where bees often are not, like low temperatures, cloudy days, or early spring. That means they help ensure that pollination is happening in all kinds of weather conditions. And beyond pollination, their larvae play a huge ecological role as decomposers, breaking down animal remains and recycling nutrients back into the ecosystem. So they are on double duty as pollinators as adults and decomposers as larvae. Beetles are in the order Coleoptera, and they're actually the oldest pollinators on Earth. They were visiting flowers long before bees evolved specialized pollination behaviors. Because of that, many of the early, older flowering plants evolved traits that specifically worked well with beetles. These flowers tend to be open, sturdy, and packed with pollen, which beetles often eat directly. Unlike bees or butterflies that quickly move between flowers, beetles often hang out on a flower for quite some time, crawling around and feeding. While they're doing that, pollen sticks to their body and gets transferred to the next flower they visit. Some scientists jokingly refer to beetle pollination as the mess in soil pollination because beetles are not particularly delicate. They chew pollen, bump around, and sometimes even damage petals. But even though they're a bit clumsy, they still move pollen effectively. In Clackamas County, one group you'll often see on flowers are soldier beetles. They're soft-bodied, orange or yellow. Orange or yellow beetles that sit on flowers like goldenrod or yarrow during summer. Another group you might see are longhorn beetles, which are named for their very long antennae. Their larvae develop in wood, so they're also connected to deadwood habitats and forests. Beetles are a really good reminder that pollinators rely on multiple habitats across their life cycles. So flowers for food, but also wood, soil, and plant material for their development. On the left, we have a soldier beetle, and on the right is a yellow velvet beetle. And you can see how hairy that yellow velvet beetle is that will just pick up all the pollen. And then on the left here, we have the bumble flower beetle. And on the right, the tumbling ragdoll flower beetle. And that bumble flower beetle is just very hairy as well. Ants are kind of more like the accidental pollinators. It's called myrmecophily. Myrmecophily. Ants are a really interesting case in pollination. They sit right on the edge of what we consider to be a pollinator. They are incredibly abundant. They move frequently between plants and they do come into contact with flowers. So while they do play while they are primary accidental pollinators, they still play a big role, if only because of their numbers. Ants can move pollen as they forage, especially on low-growing plants where they're already active. There are even a few plant species that are known to rely at least partially on ants for pollination. But overall, ants are considered relatively ineffective pollinators compared to other insects. First reason for that is that ants tend to stay very local. So, unlike flies, butterflies, or bees that move across larger areas, ants often forage within a limited range. They also produce antimicrobial secretions on their bodies, and that helps protect them against pathogens, but it also can reduce the viability of pollen. And the third reason is that ants are often interacting with plants in a totally different way. They are often involved in mutualistic relationships with plants that have nothing to do with pollination. Some plants produce nectar outside of their flowers called extrafloral nectar, which specifically attracts ants. The ants will feed on the nectar, and in return, they defend the plant from herbivores by attacking or deterring other insects. Ants are also known for farming aphids and other sap-feeding insects for honeydew, a sugary substance they produce. In these cases, ants are more focused on protecting their food source than interacting with the flowers. So, not the most effective pollinators, but it does still happen by accident. And of course, bees as pollinators. When most people think of pollinators, they think of bees, and that's for a good reason. Bees are certainly considered the most specialized and efficient pollinators because pollen isn't just something they accidentally pick up. It's an essential food source for their young. Female bees actively collect pollen, mix it with nectar, and use it to provision their nests. To do this, bees have evolved some incredible adaptation. Their bodies are covered in branched hairs, which acts almost like Velcro, trapping pollen grains as they move through flowers. Many species also have specialized pollen carrying structures, as I mentioned before, called the corbicula. Bumblebees and honeybees have the corbicula, and many solitary bees carry it in dense brushes of hair called scopae, located generally on their legs or on the underside of their abdomen. Another fascinating adaptation is buzz pollination, also called sonication. Certain flowers, like tomatoes, blueberries, and huckleberries, hold their pollen tightly inside their tube-like anthers. Bumblebees grasp these flowers and vibrate their flight muscles, shaking the pollen loose. Very few other insects can do this, making bumblebees especially important for these plants and many others. It's also important to remember that not all bees live in colonies like honeybees, and in fact, the vast majority of our native bee species are solitary. Every female generally builds her own nest, gathers her own pollen, and raises her own offspring without the help of a queen or workers. That diversity is one of the reasons that bees are such successful pollinators, but it's also why conserving a variety of habitats is so important. Different bee species nest in soil, hollow stems, old beetle burrows, or decaying wood, and they all have different flowering plants that they rely on throughout the season. And here is my local favorite. This is a metallic blue cuckoo wasp, and you can see some of the hairs that it would use to pick up some pollen. And butterflies as pollinators. Butterflies are generally considered secondary pollinators compared to bees and flies. They are less efficient at transferring pollen, and this is largely due to their long, slender legs and bodies that pretty much avoid contact with much of the plant reproductive parts. Because they have that long proboscis, they can access nectar in deeper flowers that some other insects cannot get to, which makes them highly specialized. Butterflies, moths, and skippers all belong to the insect order Lepidoptera, which means scaled wing. And if you look closely at their wings, they're actually covered in tiny overlapping scales that create their colors and patterns. And so partially the scales make them a little bit less efficient in collecting pollen as well, because the scales are not as Velcro-like as some of the hairs on bee species. And so even though butterflies, moths, and skippers are all related, these three groups behave a little differently and interact with plants in some different ways. Butterflies are the group that most people recognize. They're usually active during the day and have antennae with a rounded club at the tip. They often hold their wings upright when resting. Butterflies visit flowers to drink nectar with their proboscis and incidentally move pollen between flowers as they feed. Moths are much more diverse than butterflies, and they're essentially only active at night. And so many moths are primary pollinators and only pollinators of many night blooming plants, such as things in the yucca family. And they will travel very long distances, moths will. As will butterflies, they often migrate. Skippers are technically butterflies, but they look and behave a little differently. They tend to have thicker bodies and are a very fast darting flight pattern. Their antennae have a small hook at the tip instead of a simple round club, and they behave the same way as moths and butterflies with the flower, using their proboscis to eat nectar. And so, but they're all very pretty. Here are a couple of our local species. We have on the far left a California tortoiseshell, in the middle a woodland skipper, and on the right a white-lined sphinx. But do not let their pretty colors fool you. Butterflies also exhibit fascinating and gross behaviors that connect them to other parts of the ecosystem and contest their royal princess-like reputation. This behavior is called puddling. Puddling looks pretty weird at first. Maybe you've seen it. You might see a dozens of butterflies gathered on a muddy patch of ground or wet patch of ground. And they aren't drinking water. They are collecting minerals like sodium and nitrogen compounds that are pretty scarce in nectar. Puddling is mostly done by male butterflies. The minerals they collect are transferred to females mating and can improve egg development. And yes, they'll gather on mud, some wet soil, riverbanks, oftentimes poop or dead things, blood, and urine. And it's not a random behavior, it is connected back to that reproduction. And again, a great example of how pollinators and other insects rely on multiple resources throughout their life cycle, and even the prettiest of things can also be very gross. And here we have puddling on some wet soil on the left side, and on the right side, that is puddling behavior in blood. So, to think about some pollinator habitat, when people usually hear that, they're thinking about planting flowers, and planting flowers is very important. But as we've just seen, insects need much more than just food. They, to truly support pollinators and other invertebrate communities, especially the unconventional ones, we have to think about their entire life cycle. Each species needs different types of habitat at different stages of its life, and these can often overlap with other species. For example, many bees and beetles need undisturbed loose soil for nesting or overwintering. Others depend on rotting wood or hollow stems where larvae can develop. Flies, including all of the pollinator species mentioned, often rely on decaying organic matter or moist environments during their larval stages. Butterflies and moths need their host plants for the caterpillars, not just nectar for plants as adults. And behaviors like puddling show that something as simple as wet soil or muddy patches can be an important resource. So, when we manage landscapes too tightly by doing things like removing all the leaf litter, clearing out the dead wood, mulching heavily, or constantly disturbing our soil, we're actually removing critical pieces of habitat. Most insects rely on what we call microhabitats, and these are things like leaf litter, dead wood, areas of bare soil, damp areas that you keep damp, and standing plant stems. These small, kind of overlooked features support insects through all stages of their life. If we want to support our unconventional pollinators, the goal isn't to just add flowers, it is to create a diverse, layered habitat that includes a mix of food sources, shelter, breeding areas, and overwintering sites. So thank you so much for all that you do for our watershed and the environment at large. Just some recap, final thoughts. Pollination is a team effort. Everybody's pretty equally important and couldn't really get all the job done without all of them. Habitat is more than flowers. We need to think about what every pollinator slash beneficial insect that we want in our space, what they need for each part of their life cycle. Learning to identify species does help us become better stewards as we get to know what's around us. It helps us appreciate and want to conserve. And every species has a role. Pollinator, predator, decomposer, scavenger, aquatic, every niche is important, and the web wouldn't be complete if it weren't for all of them working together. One last call to action. We have at CRBC a pesticide pledge. You can pledge to be either pesticide free or pesticide wise. You can find that on our website or linked into the video information. And if you are a resident of the Clackamas Basin, we will send you a free metal yard sign. Thank you to our sponsors, Clackamas Water and Environmental Services and Clackamas River Water Providers. Thank you all so much for your time. And as always, if you have questions, please reach out to any one of us at Clackamas River Basin Council. Thank you.